Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this ISDP forum. We have the privilege today of having a panel and a presentation and a panel that is based on this book by Halil Karaveli with the very fascinating title, Why Turkey is Authoritarian. And Turkey, of course, is a country that after you've studied it for a while, you realize you know much less than you think. And it's also a country that doesn't really fit into any preconceived notions or categories. Very often you can find people who try to fit Turkey into some pre-existing notion, whether it's a Middle Eastern context or an Eastern European context or something. But it rarely works. And then we have a number of paradigms that have been established in order to try to understand Turkish politics over the decades, the perhaps most prominent one being this idea of a divide between secular establishment and a populist, or rather a Muslim pious society. And I think what Halil Karaveli does in this book is to try to destroy many of these preconceived paradigms and see if there is another one that might be applicable to explain the evolution we've had over the past many decades. And I should say that this is Halil and I have been working on Turkish matters for over a decade now, since we founded the Turkey Analyst in late 2007. At which point, the old notions about or the notions that dominated in Western academia and in many ways in Turkey itself, were very much stuck in these ideas that there was somehow a moderate Muslim government that was overthrowing an old secularist authoritarian establishment. We had the temerity to point out some of the flaws in this analysis, especially monitoring what the AKP government in Turkey was doing already then. It was not necessarily popular. It seems like most everybody now agrees with the analysis we had at the time. I should say that it's been quite interesting to be part of this and work with Halil for this decade and see many of the thoughts that came out of this book. I've had the privilege of hearing in their pre-written format. So this is very nice to see this book being published, and I know that Halil has just presented the book in Oxford and also I believe in Greece before that, as well as in London also. So this is Stockholm in summertime is the 4th presentation, and then 7th presentation. My God, but 4th location perhaps. Yes. Well, so we will, without much further ado, I would like to invite our panel. We have Halil, who is the author of the book, of course, who will present his thoughts, and then we will have reactions from two very, very competent guests that we have the privilege of having. One is Anders Björkman, a well-known Swedish writer who has been following Turkish affairs for a very long time, as well as Suzy Hansen, who comes most directly from London, but who has been living in Turkey for how long now? For 12 years, and has been watching all of these developments as a journalist based in Istanbul, if I'm not mistaken. So please, if you'd like to, Halil, I don't know if you would like to speak from here or stand up here. Please. So the floor is yours, and then I look forward to a discussion.
Okay. Thank you very much for that presentation. And it has been a pleasure working with you, Svante. And as one of my former bosses in journalism once told me, the important job when we work is not so much the writing, it's actually all the talking and discussions that from which articles emerge. So it has been a privilege working with Svante and having the fruitful discussions with him. Now, a friend of mine, a friend and a colleague of mine, seeing the title of this book, Why Turkey is Authoritarian, remarked that, sure, why wouldn't it be, sort of? You know, it's like the cases of China or Russia. It would seem to be a natural condition, authoritarianism in Turkey. Yet, Turkey is a case apart, because it has seemed to be, it has seemed to hold a democratic promise, unlike the two other examples I mentioned, Russia and China. Yeah. Maybe shall let that truck pass with the happy students.
You have competition.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Now, not so long ago, Turkey was held forth as a model, indeed, as a model of a Muslim democracy, and the power of the military was supposedly being broken, and the advent of democracy was near. You are of course all familiar with the standard narrative, according to which the Turkish military stages coups in order to protect secularism. I show that the secularists, the so-called secularists, and the Islamists are in fact but the two sides of the same authoritarian right. They have both the so-called secularists and the Islamists, served the same dominant economic interests to the detriment of democracy. Now, the main function of the military has not been to protect secularism. The main function of the military in Turkey has been to crush the left. The left has been the main enemy of the Turkish military. It was in order to crush the left that the Turkish military staged the coups in 1971 and the decisive one in 1980. So, and this is really something that is oddly enough overlooked in standard history. You will find no other books, almost no other books, where in English or in other non-Turkish language, where this simple fact is pointed out. It is always, the military is always portrayed as acting in defense of secularism. Nothing is mentioned about its main function. Now, the military's function has been to crush the left. The main function of the Islamists and of conservatives in general in Turkey has been to ensure that the popular masses, the working class and the peasants, are firmly attached to the right. And they have done so by exploiting identity politics, by recasting the class conflict as a cultural conflict between a pious population and a supposedly westernized elite. So you could actually say that the tradition of the Turkish right, the Turkish right-wing tradition, predates by several decades. Predates by several decades the right that we see on the rise today in Europe, in the United States, in Israel, or for that matter, in India. a right that combines a neoliberalism, a commitment to an unrestrained capitalism with religious, ethno-religious identity politics. This is a very powerful combination. And just like the Turkish right has been doing for several decades, so is the right-wing parties that are on the rise today in the West and elsewhere, recasting class conflict as a cultural conflict between the elite and the people. And similarly, the working class, including here in Sweden, is shifting over to the right-wing parties, to the far-right parties even. Now, the historical record, Sweden a century ago, Spain, Portugal, Greece in the 1970s clearly shows that the democratic left is crucial for democratization. And for Turkey, the 1970s were the turning point. It was a time when a democratic left and the socialist left and the strong labor movement were on the rise, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, winning an election in 1977, the only time the left has won an election in Turkey. And I devote a large part of my book to this crucial time, the 1970s, 2 chapters called The Social Democratic Hope and The Vengeance of the Right. I do so because this is a crucial time where Turkey could have followed the path of Spain, Portugal, and Greece, moved from right-wing authoritarianism, dictatorship, to being a European social democracy. But instead, this was a missed opportunity, or rather, Turkey was not allowed to embark on that path. Instead, it was led into the Latin American path. I pay special attention to this period because it is ignored almost totally by standard history. No one writes about it. Suzy touches on it in her book, in a rare exception. And this is perhaps because this doesn't fit into the usual narrative of secularism in Islam, because then it was a fight between left and right. It kind of disturbs the perception we have of Turkey. I have a little bit of a personal stake in that period, because I lived I grew up in Turkey in the 1970s. I witnessed it firsthand. Me and a couple of my friends, we were supposed to be on Taksim Square in Istanbul in May 1st, 1977, because our school was close nearby at Istiklal. And for some reason, I don't remember why, I decided not to join. At that day, right-wing shooters, snipers, attacked that 1st of May rally, killing over 40 people. And that was just one occasion. During 1975 and 1980, the rise of the left triggered a violent backlash, a violent reaction, a terrible reaction from the forces of the right. The paramilitary gangs of the right killed 5,000 people between 1975 and 1980. The cream of the intelligentsia of Turkey, left-wing intellectuals, professors, other academics, students, labor activists, including some family friends. And the business community financed campaigns calling for the overthrow of the social democratic-led government. And the United States could not allow a strategically important country like Turkey, bordering the Soviet Union and Iran, to shift to the left. So the National Security Advisor of President Jimmy Carter encouraged the Turkish military to overthrow Bülent Ecevit, the social democratic leader. So present-day Turkey is thus very much a legacy of the anti-leftism of the Cold War. And it is shaped by the military coup 1980 that finished off the jobs of the that the paramilitary gangs had started, and which extinguished the social democratic hope. There's actually an interesting parallel here to Chile, because I said Turkey was led into the Latin American path. What happened in Chile in 1973, what happened in Turkey in 1980 was actually kind of similar to what happened in Chile in 1973. And the Turkish right actually used, called Bülent Ecevit, the leader of the democratic left, they called him Buyende as an allusion to Salvador Allende, showing what they had in mind for him. They tried to kill him on several occasions, and as I describe in one of the occasions vividly in the book, he survived. Now, and Turkey's Pinochet was General Kenan Evren. He crushed the left and imposed a neoliberal economic order. But the funny thing is that many years later, Chile recovered. Today, Chile has, I believe, a conservative president, but has also had several social democratic presidents before that. So Chile was able to re-embark on a reformist path. That has never happened in Turkey. So that is kind of something that begs for an explanation. Why was it possible for Chile to recover, while it has not been possible for Turkey to recover? I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but I think it's an important question and an interesting question to reflect on. Now, what the military did after taking power, this has already started earlier, but they accelerated the population of the state bureaucracy with members of religious fraternities, because these were reliable anti-socialists. A certain Fethullah Gülen in 1980 welcomed the coup. Many years later, in 2005, he reiterated his admiration for General Evren, saying that the Pasha has earned himself a place in heaven. Indeed, you could say that the plants, the seeds for the coup, the Gülenist coup 2016, were planted 1980. When the office, from starting in the 1970s, offices with any kind of leftist inclinations were purged and replaced with reliable religious conservatives, and for which Turkey has paid dearly. Now, having expressed so much criticism of the right, I also need to say that the left is also part of the problem. The left has sustained and abetted authoritarianism. Now, when I talk about the left in Turkey, there are, of course, the marginal socialist left, the Marxist left, but the mainstream left in Turkey, we have the mainstream left. I call them the Kemalist left in the book. And there's a second one, the liberal left, which has been intellectually dominant during the last decades. Now, the Kemalist left, which used to be dominant, is a version of what the French call gauche républicain. That means this is a left that cares about progress, enlightenment, that sees religion as an expression of backwardness, and that seeks to educate and enlighten the people. It takes issue not with capitalism, not with social injustices, but with religion. And of course, the only leftist leader in Turkey who has been successful in reaching out to the masses, Bülent Ecevit in the 1970s, he called this the historical mistake of the left. He said it is a mistake to call the pious reactionaries. You can be, he said, a progressive. You can go to the mosque on Friday and still be a progressive. And he was rewarded for that. His party, Democratic Leftist Party, carried the conservative heartland of Turkey in 1977, showing that religious people could very well vote for the left. Now, but in its usual incarnations, this Kemalist left has alienated the popular masses and pushed them into the arms of the right. And this particular kind of left has also alienated the Kurds with a stubborn nationalism. While they have treated religion as an expression of backwardness, these leftists have taken the unitary nation state to be a civilizational achievement, and have made them unable to understand and show empathize with the aspirations of Kurds and other minorities. Finally, we have the liberal left. The liberal left is not a party. It's a group of intellectuals. They have dominated Turkish academia and the columns of the Turkish press since the early 1990s. Now, this liberal left has done Turkish democracy great harm by supporting the Islamists, and not least by legitimizing them in the eyes of Western opinion. There are a string of liberal leftist Turkish intellectuals who have, traveled around Europe and the United States confirming that the Islamists and the AKP were true Democrats. Now, the liberal leftists, they put their faith in a rising class, in a new class of religious capitalists. They celebrated the victory of AKP as Turkey's bourgeois revolution. I suppose that you could say that they were misled by Marx, being, in many cases, former Marxists, these liberal leftists. Because Marx, as you may recall, admired the capitalist class as the most revolutionary force that history had witnessed. His idea was that socialism was going to build on what the capitalist class had created, but he was a great admirer of the capitalist class. Maybe that is the reason why so many Turkish liberal leftists who were initially Marxists have so readily embraced this expression of sorry? Yeah, exactly. This bourgeois revolution. Now, ultimately, the history of modern Turkey is, I believe, an exhortation to ponder the relation between capitalism and authoritarian politics in general. Because the Turkish case illustrates that religious and nationalist identity politics that subvert democracy are the corollary of unbridled capitalism. They are harnessed, the religious, ethno-religious identity politics are harnessed to paper over social and economic unrest. India is another striking case in point, where the Hindu Nationalist Party a couple of weeks ago carried the election once again. So to conclude, I believe that Turkey is a particularly instructive case to study today, at the time of a global rise of the right. There, I think I will be. Stop.
Thank you. I think Anders put some water in the wrong throat. That's okay. So that gives us a good occasion to have the floor over to you, Suzy. We'll give you some time to recover. And tell us what you are. How does this fit with your living in Istanbul and observing much of this history from within?
Thank you. So I can explain maybe a little bit about why I find Halil's perspective so helpful and illuminating, and I can also kind of talk about how Western journalists, or maybe American journalists, have viewed Turkey and how they have written about Turkey, and how my own coverage of Turkey has changed. I primarily now write for the New York Times Magazine, but not that often. So I arrived in 2007 when it was right on the eve of Erdogan's second national election. So after this election, he became prime minister, a member of his party became president, and they had a majority in parliament. So this was a huge deal. But it was a time when a lot of these liberal thinkers and Western thinkers were really quite excited about the AKP, and I would count myself amongst them. I think that I was very much swept up in that period of hopefulness about this party, and that was primarily for two reasons, I think, but I honestly came to realize this much later, and I'll explain why. I think one of the reasons was that as an American coming from New York post 9/11, I definitely was coming from this place where there was suddenly this spike in anti-Muslim sentiment. And so to arrive in Turkey, where there were a lot of secularists and Kemalists who were very anti-AKP, it kind of, I think I was feeling very sensitive to that, because I was seeing this ugliness at home, and I think, in a way, I was bringing all of this baggage with me to Turkey, and I think this is something that journalists always have to keep in mind, that it takes a very, very long time before you start to see a country from within that country's perspective and not from your own, but it takes years. So I think that was one reason, but I think a more important reason was that I, too, was very much caught up in this story of Islamists versus secularists, because it fit very much into the dominant narrative that all Americans had about Turkey, and also it was kind of dramatic, and there were, it was something that you could see easily play out in conversations. People would say very nasty things about people wearing headscarves, and vice versa. And Erdogan and AKP, of course, were using this very liberal rhetoric. The rhetoric was very canny. It was really beautifully done, and the Gülenis, I think, played a large part in that, but it was very appealing to Western ears. But I think one of the main reasons it was appealing was because it was also this kind of pro-business rhetoric. And I don't think that many of the Western journalists would have admitted that at the time if they themselves, if they considered themselves leftists at home or any. But I think that in a way there was a way that this rhetoric worked on Westerners because it sounded familiar, and it was a way of saying, oh, they might be Islamists, but there is a way in which they are very similar to us and our traditions and everything else. And so I think that this was all in a lot of journalists' subconscious. I don't think that anyone would have acknowledged it, known it, admitted it, but I can tell a story, and again, this brings me back to Halil's book, because 7 years later, I was still in Turkey, and I covered this mine fire. You might have heard about it. It was in Soma, in a small town, and 301 miners died in this fire, and it was one of the worst, most tragic days I've certainly experienced in Turkey, and one of the saddest periods. And I think that a lot of people were in shock, especially because Erdogan's party reacted in this quite callous way. And when I went down there and started talking to the miners, of course, what I learned was, as soon as I started talking to them, what they wanted to tell me about was not only the conditions in this mine, but this long history of what had happened to workers in Turkey. And this was something that I had never heard anyone really talk about at all. And it made me suddenly feel like I had to go back and relearn Turkish history in a way, because it was not just about what had happened to workers, how their rights had eroded, it was what had happened to unions, and that, of course, went back to the 1980 coup, and that also went back to Turkey's relationship with the United States. And suddenly this entire history felt not only like, oh, this is an important thing I've missed, but actually the fundamental story. And I think that this is a lot of, and again, because many of us journalists were so distracted by this Islamism versus secularism narrative and this kind of drama playing out, nobody was focusing on what changes the government was actually making to the country. What was happening to the laws? What was happening to public procurement? What was happening with the privatization of these companies? What was happening to ordinary people who were working for them? And I think that it was a vast, and now that we're seeing a lot of the details. I mean, now people are looking into this more. It's a very fascinating story of how this party actually changed the country. But I think that journalists had been more steeped in some of this longer history about American influence and about the economic evolution of the country and about workers primarily. I think that there would have been a different kind of focus and a different kind of examination of the party. And so I have particularly loved in this book this history that focuses on the 60s and 70s, because if you read other histories of Turkey, it's as if the 60s and 70s, I mean, they take up maybe a few pages. It's really remarkable. And it actually seems to me, if I could, I just want to read memoirs of the 60s and 70s now and not much else, because I really think that it's an absolutely fascinating time, and I think that this is what Halil's book addresses. And also, something I have to say, you also focus a lot on the nationalists and the how deeply entrenched they are in the country. And I think you said to me a year before anyone else was saying it that, Erdogan is not necessarily the all-powerful person in the country as everyone thinks he is. The nationalists and the Nationalist Party still have quite a lot of power, and he is quite dependent on them as well. So, that is why I like to draw on Halil's work for my own. So, thank you.
Is it on? Yeah. It's better if I have my own mic. I have this cold. I'm sorry. I have a hard time to get rid of it. Was there a question or no?
No, your perspective, your thoughts, your reactions.
My perspective, I work with Svenska Dagbladet, Stockholm Daily, and I work with the culture section, and so I normally don't deal with foreign affairs and things like that. But I have a special relation to Turkey. I first came to Turkey in 1984, and I remember seeing Atatürk on all these portraits in shops, at the airport, and so forth, but also portraits of Kenan Evren, the general. And I saw a lot of gendarma and police and army officers, and this gave me an airy feeling. But I'm married to a woman of Turkish descent, although she's Assyrian Syriac, Syriani, I think that Turks call it. And they have a special relation to Turkey also. And they see Atatürk and the nationalists and the army as their protectors in a slightly simplistic way. But they see Islam as a threat, or Islamists anyway. So she said, and that made me wonder, that she felt safer with all these military persons all over the place. So that's how it started. We were very young, and following Turkey, I've learned that Turkey is a little bit like an onion. You peel one layer off and there's another layer, and you still don't understand what's happening. Anyway, this view of conception of Turkey and Turkish political history as being a fight, a conflict between the Kemalists or the secularists and the Islamists is a very strong conception, and therefore I find this book very interesting, and I think it might do some good, because probably there's a lot of progress that could have been done if the Turks had not been so preoccupied with this conflict. You call for a Turkish left, or that's what's needed, you say in the book, and I was always intrigued, or I couldn't understand why the Kemalists, having the power for such a long time, why they did not try to, why did they not build the roads, the hospitals, or install the welfare system, or as Erdogan did as a mayor, make the garbage system work? They could have done that, but they didn't. So what's my point now? I don't know. Anyway, I think the book is very useful in the further discussion about Turkey and its political system.
Any reactions from you before we open up the discussion? You can hold it.
Just to think about, there's this term that is I sometimes ask my audiences, implore them not to use the term Kemalist, although I just did it myself when I talked about the Kemalist left. But when you use it as a term, why, as you just did, the Kemalists, they were ruling Turkey, the question is, who were the ones who were ruling Turkey, first of all? I think a more proper definition of the ideological orientation of the parties that rule Turkey until recently would be nationalist conservative. If you call that Kemalism, fine, but that is not the thing. When you use the term Kemalist in the West, people understand from that it conjures the image of a knight in the service of enlightenment. You know, back in the 1960s, this was something new, fine. President John F. Kennedy, he expressed his admiration for Atatürk, and in Western academia, Turkey was held up as an example, successful example of a developing country. Now that changed later, and Kemalism became a pejorative term in the West. But you know, I think that term should be, if not abandoned, but at least it has to be defined. And when you talk about which I do in the book, I divide Turkish history into two distinct eras. First, the first 15 years when Atatürk ruled, that was the era of radical secularism. That was no question about it, that Atatürk had an issue with Islam, that he said about radically change Turkish society. Now, almost created a new society. But it's also important to note that the secularist reforms of Atatürk laid the foundations of a modern capitalist society. I noticed right at the beginning of the book saying that the cadres that founded the Turkish state had one ambition, and that was to create what they called the national bourgeoisie. They wanted to create a class of capitalists, which of course they did, with expropriation of the goods of the exterminated Armenians and the Greeks that had been driven away from Anatolia. That was the dowry of the new Turkish state. Now, what I'm trying to say is that secularism is not something that exists in a vacuum. It was socially and economically functional. It served the interest of a new capitalist society, removing the remnants of the old feudal society. Now the thing is that after Atatürk, you have a different Turkey. And very quickly, this radical secularism is actually abandoned, already during the 1940s, just a few years after his death. And it is abandoned because of the onset of the Cold War changes the perception of the Turkish elite. They suddenly realize that they see the left as a threat. And they realize that they have to use religion to make sure that the youth, as they say, is inoculated against socialism. And which means that the ostensibly secular elite of Turkey very early on started to use Islamization as a way of countering or checking their left. They start already in the early 1940s. So, therefore, talking about Kemalism as a term that kind of includes both the early era of the Republic and which was followed afterwards is misleading. It creates the false impression that Turkey has been ruled by an elite that was reading Voltaire and the French classics and who saw its main mission as enlightening the people. As my father once said, you don't think that the Turkish generals are sitting and reading Voltaire on their free time. It's not like that. So therefore the term, Turkey has been ruled by different versions of nationalist conservatives. And lately, for the last 15 years, Islamic conservatives have been in power. So this is not, sometimes my critics accuse me of underestimating the importance of the present regime. They say that this regime has brought about a qualitative change. I disagree. It may be that the religious identity as part of the national life, it was always part of the Turkish national identity, the religious part. Maybe that is strongly emphasized. It is strongly emphasized today, but it is not a qualitative change. The Islamic conservatives have actually not invented anything new that the secular conservatives hadn't done. So there is a string of leaders, right-wing leaders, starting with Adnan Menderes, the first conservative prime minister, first democratically elected in 1950, over to Süleyman Demirel, the leader of the right in the 1960s and 70s, later president, the coup leader, General Evren, on to the present leader of Turkey. They are, so there's absolutely nothing special about the present leadership of Turkey. It has built upon the legacy of several decades of right-wing rule. So, and it's actually funny, from an intellectual point of view, how so many people, how so many otherwise intelligent people, academics, writers, journalists, in Turkey and internationally, have misunderstood Turkey for so long. And it sometimes makes me wonder, what else are we being misrepresented? I know Turkey well, but there are a whole lot of other countries that I don't know so well. And I'm a consumer of news. What about Russia? What we are told about Russia? What we are told about several other countries? So this is more of a kind of intellectual reflection. Maybe it is the case that, as one journalist friend of mine commented several years ago, when I was trying to point out the complexities in the Turkish situation back in 2008, he told me that you may be right, Halil said. But this is, he said, the established narrative. And people need narratives. Good guys, bad guys. Secularists, Islamists, or whatever you call them in different, So people have, and we also, as human beings, we have this need to believe in fairy tales. We need to believe in good guys and bad guys. The present leader of Turkey, the present president, used to be admired in the West as the democratic liberal hero. Now he has become the incarnation of evil. He is the incarnation of the Eastern despot. He's the same guy. Nothing has changed. But it illustrates our childish need to believe in, Santa Claus or the bad guys. It is as simple as this, unfortunately, I believe.
Could I follow up with a question, and then I will open up to the audience? Now, and actually, probably two questions that are related. So the first is, if we are now beyond the secular Islamist division, and there seems to be a lot of signs that both in the discussion in Turkey and even in the politics of Turkey, you now have another Islamist party that is aligned with the other opposition parties. And I'm thinking about the post-Erdogan phase, because he's not there forever. He could be there for 1 year, 5 years, 20 years. But there is a post-Erdogan period. Is there a chance that Turkey will then follow the path of other, let's say, countries that have been ruled by right-wing regimes for a very long time, that have actually had a much more successful record, if you look globally, transitioning into democracy than left-wing regimes have? I mean, Angola, Ethiopia, Cuba, former Soviet countries, China, haven't done so well. Chile, South Korea, Taiwan actually have moved in the direction. And Turkey, in that way, kind of stands out as the example of the Cold War right-wing authoritarian regime that did not fully succeed in its transition to democracy. So is there a chance that it's just delayed, that something will happen? By the way, the big exception to what I just said is the Middle East as a whole, where this has not happened. and part of this, then, that leads to a very specific question, which is how important then is intra-class conflict, if you will, the very deep conflicts that exist within this ruling elite. I mean, you can see it, for example, in the fact that the nationalist movement split over support for Erdogan, and you now have two parties that are opposed to each other, and so forth.
That was a lot.
Yes.
I sure know what needs to be done. And I write about that part of the book as well. What Turkey needs sort of is a progressive front that would counter the ruling nationalist front. And by progressive front, that would include Turkish social democrats, democratic leftists, social liberals, and Kurdish democratic leftists. So what happened in the 1970s showed that Bülent Ecevit, the leader of the social democracy then, he showed that this secular Islam, this divide between the religious, the cultural divide could be transcended. He showed that with policies that address the social concerns of the people, the broad masses, and which also showed respect for their culture and religion. So that could be done. He demonstrated that. And later the example now more recently of Selahattin Demirtas, the Kurdish leader who is in prison now, or the pro-Kurdish leader, who is a democratic leftist, who has also succeeded in reaching out to Turkish democratic leftists and liberals with his progressive agenda, which he's a modern leftist with, feminism and gay rights, things like that, are figure prominently in his figure were important in his program. So he has shown. I sometimes think that the combination of Bülent Ecevit from the 1970s, with his emphasis on social justice and respect for people's religion and culture, and Selahattin Demirtas today, who kind of transcends the ethnic divide, the Turkish-Kurdish ethnic divide, with a generally progressive agenda. The combination of these two figures would be the ideal leader, and would stand a chance to succeed, definitely. Now, for that to happen, for this progressive front to come together, I believe that several groups need to do their homework. Now, first of all, if you take the middle-class progressives in urban areas, people who can call the Kemalist left, they need to start paying attention to the working class. Now, let me give you one example. When this terrible new airport was being built in Istanbul, which is an environmental disaster, which is also a disaster in many other respects, hundreds of workers lost their lives during the construction of the airport. Now, and by the way, since the AKP came to power, 22,000 workers have lost their lives in Turkey in workplace accidents. Turkey holds, after China, the world record in workplace fatal accidents. And actually, in relative terms, Turkey is on top because of its population. It's much lower than China's. Now, and this also kind of illustrates the neoliberal order. The labor unions have the workforce is rendered powerless. Now, when the airport was being built, these middle-class progressives, Kemalists, were busy starting Facebook groups, another kind of, social media organizations, because they were calling for the name of the old airport in Istanbul that has been shut down, Atatürk, to be given to the new airport. This was their major issue. The new airport should be named Atatürk. There were Facebook groups. There were, to my knowledge, not a single Facebook group that cared about what was happening to the workers there. So this is kind of a start fussing about Atatürk and symbols, and look what's happening to the working class. Unless the middle class progressives start paying attention, the working class will continue to be lured by religious and other identity politics of the right, which has been the case for several decades now. So that is good. The middle class progressives need to do their homework, open their eyes. And actually, I hail from such a family, typical Istanbul bourgeoisie. Last summer when I was in Istanbul, they were sitting there having a nice garden party. Everyone was, so sad after the election last year, that they lost again, the presidential election. Yeah, they had thought that their guy was going to win it. He didn't, so they were very sad. But after a while, I had to say, I don't know why you are complaining. You are doing fine. I didn't want to be too rude, of course, but the fact is that I used that statistic in an article in the New York Times recently. The 1%, the richest 1% of Turkey, they have increased their share of the national wealth by 43%, I believe, during the AKP's years in power. Now controlling 57% of the national wealth. Okay, so here we go. The regime portrays itself as a populist regime, it claims to be on the side of the people, but is actually on the side of the economic elite. But this economic elite is not grateful. They are complaining because they don't like them in cultural terms, because they wear the headscarf. Okay? So here we have a clash of class interest and cultural affinities. So I had to tell them, why are you complaining? You're doing great. No. So, one group that needs to do its homework is the Turkish Social Democracy, the CHP. They have to emancipate from their father figure Atatürk. They have to abandon their nationalism. They have to. That is the only way they will reach out to be able to reach out to the Kurds, embrace their aspirations. And they have to, of course, pay attention to social issues, yes, and they also have to pay attention to the Kurdish aspirations. So they have to emancipate from Atatürk. There also the Kurdish movement, political movement, also needs to do its homework. They, in turn, need to emancipate from their father figure, Öcalan, on this prison island. Because their nationalism it prevents them from, is something that is a handicap for them. As long as they have not emancipated from their nationalist father figure, they will have a hard time convincing their Turkish counterparts, the Turkish Social Democrats, Turkish democratic leftists, that they actually could be part of a common progressive front. So they both. But I believe that if the Turkish Social Democrats show the way, that would go a long way in convincing the Kurds, which was actually the most politically conscious constituency in Turkey today. And instead we have Demirtas is in prison today because the so-called Social Democratic Party voted in favor in Parliament for lifting their parliamentary immunity in 2016. So you cannot. This doesn't work, and it doesn't work having a right, a left, so-called left, that thinks that. Most recently, I talked about the 1970s, the leader of the right-wing gang, Alparslan Turkish, who was responsible for the killing of thousands of people. The president recently suggested that his name be given to a university. Imagine the name of a mass murderer like that in any other country, a political mass murderer be given to a university. Franco in Spain or Pinochet in Chile, or not to speak about Hitler. Now, the leader of the so-called Social Democratic Party, Kılıçdaroğlu, said that was a great idea, and he is the successor of Bülent Ecevit, who was almost killed by Turkish gangs. So this is a problem. The left has disappeared in Turkey, and I think that this is because the 1980 coup was such a devastating blow that they have concluded that the only way they can win is by being more right-wing. That they have concluded that we can only win the people, win over the people, by being more right than the right. Now, Svante said something, just let me say the thing about the intra-class. There is an interesting shift in the Turkish capitalist class. When the AKP rose to power, it primarily represented the business class in Anatolia, more pious, more religious, more traditional capitalists. And there was a rivalry between them and the established bourgeoisie in Istanbul, the major cities. Okay? And this was the background to one of the many things that happened during the 1990s. But AKP actually was the result of a intra-class alliance. Because both the Koç group and the Sabancıs, they all endorsed Erdogan. So one of the so-called westernized secular business barons of Turkey said that Erdogan is great. His combination of neoliberalism and cultural conservatism is perfect for us, he said. So what we see today is that what we see today is mainly that a flight of capital from Turkey, and of course Turkish business they don't have any problem with the regime like the AKP, absolutely not. But they cannot afford a regime that is at odds with the United States and the West, because that will cut them off from the capital flows from the West. And that is the reason why Ömer Koç, the leading capitalist in Turkey, made a point of paying a visit to the mayor-elect in Istanbul the day before he was deposed, Ekrem İmamoğlu, showing that he is our guy. This is the guy that we, the big capitalists, want as a leader of Turkey. And the question is, will the capitalists get their way, or will the state get its way? I don't know.
Fascinating. How about our panelists? What do you think of a post AKP or post Erdogan era, and when and if that arrives? Will we continue in the same way, or is there opportunities that you see going forward?
Well, since I was there for the attempted military coup in 2016, I think I know better than to predict anything in Turkey. For that reason, it also I remain actually more hopeful than I think a lot of observers from the outside, because I think that anything can happen in Turkey, and I think that what we see right now, since I am still living there, you see. Okay, in the election that we just had, which Erdogan then canceled, you saw a lot of very pro-Erdogan, pro-AKP voters, primarily women, I think, who were the ones doing the food shopping and who were feeling really this terrible economic crisis that they're going through. They can't afford the staples of the Turkish diet. They can't afford tomatoes. They can't afford onions. They can't afford... And these women and a lot of people are really so angry about what has happened to the economy and what has been happening with the country, and a lot of the undemocratic moves that the government has made. And they're able to see all of this and make these decisions and vote this way, despite the fact that they have loved this party for a long time. And frankly, the party did in a lot of people's eyes, improved a lot of services, improved healthcare, did a lot of things that they really appreciated. And before that, they saw the other political parties as never doing anything, basically. So it's very hard to diverge from voting for this party, but they're also able to vote, they finally were able to vote against them in an environment where they have no access to any information, really, about the other political parties or about what's actually going on with this government, because the government controls the media. And so I think in these kinds of moments, you see this kind of I think of it as a kind of pragmatism in the Turkish voter and in Turks that are just kind of like, okay, this has all gone on a little too long. Something is not right here. And of course, there is now this new kind of wealth and this visible wealth and cronyism that I think it's, again, trickling out more and more in the last years. You have this enormous palace that the president lives in. You have these very visible kind of weddings of the businessmen and the children of the businessmen close to Erdogan, and these kind of scandals, that I think are really turning people off. And so who knows, But again, I think you're right that the viable alternatives have been so disappointing, and this is why this mayor, who did win the Istanbul election, has been. I think a lot of people are really they're kind of enamored with this man because he's not using hateful language. He doesn't use hateful rhetoric. A lot of people are very tired of being forced, as they say, to kind of hate the rest of their country. He uses very conciliatory language, and he's talking about unity, and I think that a lot of people really like this guy, even though he is also a construction magnate, right? So we have to keep in mind that he's not going to be a radical. But I think it's just a breath of fresh air, and And most people that I hear, in terms of the middle class and whether they will protest anything or really motivate to, the reason they didn't protest the airport, I thought that was very, very interesting. But I think a lot of them are also very scared, and I think that what they're waiting to see with this election and with this mayoral candidate and with CHP right now is, are they going to lead? Are they going to give them, the rest of the people, a path to actually articulate their grievances and how they're feeling? So in other words, if there is some funny business with the election that is coming up, I think that a lot of people will just wait to see what kind of lead CHP takes.
Thank you. Anders?
Well, this Kurdish guy I spoke to from Diyarbakir some years ago, he said, look, I don't like Erdogan. I really don't want to vote for him, but he's done a lot, as you were saying, for us. So a lot of infrastructure, social improvements. So he said, I think I'll vote for him anyway. And I think that's what is needed to spread the welfare. I mean, in the southeast, it's been so backward so long, and I don't know why. I think that would improve the situation a lot. And also cooperation within all the democratic forces. I mean, you were speaking about the Kurds have to do their lesson as well. I think in a way they did when Demirtas recommended his voters to vote for the CHP in the local elections. And thanks to them, probably CHP won in Ankara, Istanbul, and Izmir. I think maybe they would have won in Izmir anyway, but the two other cities. So they have shown a way, and of course the CHP has to change. It's not, they cannot say cooperate with the AKP to put the Demirtas behind bars and then expect them to like them. So, but anyway, I think the Demirtas gesture was very important, and they say a drowning man will catch at the straw. Well, I hope they will catch at this straw then, because there's something to build from that. And you were saying earlier that Erdogan is the same guy. I mean, he was a hero in the beginning and now he's a bad guy. Well, he is the same guy, but he didn't show the same face. And also all these liberal leftists from Turkey were saying to all the liberal friends in Europe, this is the guy. So it was kind of easy to get fooled, I would say.
It's easy to have hindsight. Hindsight is 20/20, as we say. Now, from our participants, our audience, I'm sure there are thoughts, questions, protests, or something like that. Yeah, Eric, do we have another microphone, or should we use one of these?
Yeah, use one of those.
Somebody might be able to walk the microphone to our... Who would like to start? Right there.
Hi, my name is Waris, and I'm a researcher at Stockholm University. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. During your presentation, you mentioned that the Turkish model, they used to give an example of Turkish model in the Muslim world. My question to you is, what and when things went wrong? And if we start pointing fingers, who is to be blamed for that? Yeah, thank you.
That's a great question. What went wrong? Yeah.
Was it ever a model?
No, of course not. It is. I'm a little bit at a loss there, pointing out what that story still is waiting to be written. Actually, what happened during these AKP years. But you could say basically what there's very much attention being paid to Erdogan. I had promised not to use his name today, but now I did. Finally, I succumbed to this temptation. That he sort of, it was all his fault.
he is such a power-hungry man, so he doesn't tolerate any dissent. That's a childish explanation. The reason is, I think that you have to look at, in a way, what has happened to Turkey these years is connected to what happened, what I talked about during my lecture and what I describe in the book, the legacy of the Cold War, which kind of handed over the Turkish state to the religious fraternities because they were reliable anti-socialists. Okay? And this meant primarily the Gülenists. Okay? They were the ones who were in the best position to exploit that possibility, that opportunity, which they did. They were the allies of Erdogan first, and when he eventually refused to give them everything they wanted, they hit back at him, to which he responded, and we landed where we are now. So I would say that Fethullah Gülen, I would put him at the top of my list. If you ask for who is the guilty guy here, I would say Fethullah Gülen, and going back to his hero, Kenan Evren, the general in 1980, okay? Erdogan has had to play with his cards. One of his former allies, a Turkish intellectual, actually once told me that when we came to power, he said, we looked around the country, we saw there are different groups. There's the army, there are the Gülenists, and there is the PKK. Okay, these are the major groupings in society and the state. And he said we had to cooperate with one of them. We couldn't take on all of them at the same time. So we went with the Gülenists, okay? And we had to explore the peace talks with the PKK. But then the Gülenists turned against us, and we had to turn to the army, which actually had almost been taken over by the Gülenists, which was kind of a double-edged sword. But what happened, so that kind of illustrates that Erdogan has to play with different, he is not a single actor, he is not omnipotent. He has to kind of rely on someone, he has to align himself with someone. It was the Gülenists, and now it's more the traditional Turkish right-wing nationalists who have traditionally ruled the Turkish state alongside the religious fraternities that are in power, okay? They're like Bahçeli. His so-called junior partner represents them. So that means that most of the things that happened during the early years of the AKP, when people in the West thought that Turkey was becoming democratic, why did we assume that? We assumed that because all these military personnel were being put in jail. Okay, that was the sign of democratization, the Ergenekon and the sledgehammer trials. But now, in hindsight, we know that this was not a question of democratization. It was the Gülenists in the judiciary and the police who were purging these guys so that they could replace them. Okay, now we have the mirror image. Now everyone said Erdogan is the bad guy. He has established a dictatorship, or at least an authoritarian regime. And now, just like it was wrong to credit him with democratization earlier, it is wrong to blame him for what is the bad things that are happening today. Because actually, he has to execute, or he is a spokesperson for a regime. And those who are executing, for instance, take the Istanbul rerun. Was the election cancelled because Erdogan could not accept defeat, or was it because the deep state, the Turkish deep state, the nationalists in the Turkish state cannot tolerate that an alliance that relies on the Kurds carries the election? This sort of... so your question was, whose fault? If you ask me for the name, I would give Fethullah Gülen.
Since there's probably enough blame to go around, who would you blame? or would you blame anybody?
No, I have this cold.
He has a cold.
I have my own mic.
Are you attached?
No, just slightly.
Well, I think I'm going to answer the question with a question because I'm not blaming anyone in Turkey for anything in particular. But I guess my question was, I think I also do not believe that we can lay everything at Erdogan's feet. I think we have this really big problem, especially in journalism, and I could complain about journalism all day, but right now of this kind of big man syndrome. Everybody's just obsessed with hating these guys, and we know who they are, and I don't want to say their names either. And so that is this, since everyone loves that, people love to read these stories also that blame it. So if I ever try, and I do try, to write about, you know, these more complex forces going on, for example, I don't think you can understand when everyone says, you know, why did Erdogan become so authoritarian? This is like the way that it's phrased. You can't understand that without understanding what happened between he and the Gülenists, not only because because it was terrifying, I think, for him also, and I think that it has made him forever paranoid, and this kind of paranoia is very, very... but nobody can even understand the Gülenists. You can't even really go down that road, and again, that's another thing that really requires this understanding of history. But my question when we started talking about this originally was just, how much does it have to do with the fact that Erdogan was this guy, and he's the same guy, that kind of thing? I was also wondering, how much does it have to do with the institutions of the country, and whether they were likely to change and whether they were likely to resist change, and how the institutions were obviously in this case we had this kind of taking over of institutions, but was there a certain kind of vulnerability of those institutions, and how much, of course, did it also have to do with the EU process and the economy? So I don't think there is probably one group to blame either, no, but a lot of bad things altogether.
No, well, I also find it hard to find one person to blame. And the Fethullah Gülen movement, to me, it's just recently that I've started to understand what really happened. But if maybe you could blame how the Republic was constructed once. I mean, it started in chaos or after chaos, and with a genocide behind it, and with a thought that everyone in this former empire that had so many ethnic differences, religious differences, should suddenly become Turkish Muslim, all of them, in a way. That was the aim, anyway. And I think this is a problem, because you have, I don't know how many million people that consider themselves to be Kurds, not, even though they're Turkish citizens. And you used to have a minority of Jews and Christians, not so many anymore. And I think that's maybe a strange answer to your question, but I think you could also blame that.
And that's related to what Halil speaks about in the book about the development of a national bourgeoisie, because that is exactly because the capital in the country had been in the hands of non-Turkic peoples, right?
Now, the funny thing that regarding what you said about the big men, I spoke to a German journalist-based correspondent in Istanbul, and we talked about the deeper dynamics of what's happening in Turkey. He said, "I understand that." He said, "Yeah, okay, sure." But the problem is that when I send an article like that to my editors in Germany, they send it back. They don't want that. They only want an Erdogan article. So it's a problem that we also focused on individuals today, and yeah.
At the same time, I would like to say, I try to follow Turkey, I don't speak Turkish, through English language Turkish medias, and now there are some, but they're not anything to read. So I would say German press is really doing a good job, though, covering Turkey. That's where I get my information these days.
Any further questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Süha Zülfikar. I'm counselor at the Turkish Embassy. I don't have a specific question, but I have some remarks to make. First, Mr. Karaveli, in his opening speech, he described the 1970s as of course, he lived these years, as I understood, in Turkey, but I heard these years from my father, because he was also a Bülent Ecevit's supporter, and from CHP party. And you mentioned that you explained this time as like only the left wing, left left-wing supporters have been killed. But as far as I know, there was a mutual killings between two sides, and I know that rightist ministers, even the former prime ministers, also have been killed by the left-wing militants. And you mentioned that coup affected the socialists and social democrats in Turkey, and it's true. After mostly they have been targeted by the military junta, and but after at the elections, the political parties have been banned, and the SHP, Social Democrat People's Party, they were going to win the elections. But there was division between two left parties, the party of Bülent Ecevit, because he didn't wanted to, he felt betrayed by his followers, and he founded a new Democratic Left Party. And because of this division between them, they couldn't win the elections, and it's happened in the 1995 elections, local elections, which the Erdogan won. Because of this division, the left lost these elections. So the coup affected the left, but again they had this chance to become to power, but they lost it because of these divisions. And Mr. Björkman, you mentioned that why the Kemalists didn't make road, and why didn't build this wealth state. And the current railroad line of all the Turkey has been built by the Kemalist regime during CHP, but they didn't build the roads because the roads would bring the dependency to other countries, but Turkey had the possibilities, the resources to build his own railroad. That's why they choose, and even at that time, during the Atatürk time, we had our plane factory in Kayseri. We could, produce our own planes. And you mentioned also, Mr. Karaveli, you said that CHP should be emancipated from Atatürk, and the Kurdish side should be emancipated by Öcalan. I cannot. Maybe it should be. It should be. Yeah, you are right, but I cannot accept my personal view. I cannot accept Atatürk and Öcalan in the same sentence. One is a terrorist, leader of a terrorist organization, and Atatürk is the founder of the Turkish Republic. So this is what I want to mention. And you, Mr. Björkman, you again mentioned about the genocide. I'm not sure which genocide you are mentioning, because Sweden has accepted, has recognized lots of genocide, the Seyfo and Armenian genocide. I am from Bitlis. In 1915, there was a strong minority of Armenians, and I have lots of Armenian friends in Turkey also. But in 1915, there was a revolt of Armenians because the Russians were invading this region. They invaded this region, and the Armenians have collaborated with the occupiers. And my the uncle of my grandmother, he was fighting against these Russians, but he was decapitated by Armenians, and his head they put his head on a stick, and they put it on the entry of the city. So it's not, of course, we accept what they suffered, the Armenians. We don't deny, but labeling this what happened, this event 1915 as a genocide, I think it's not agreed by all international community. So it's up to historians to decide, not the parliaments and other circles. That's what.
Thank you.
Maybe I should give it a few.
Please.
Well, I'm not an historian, I'm not in the parliament, but I'm a journalist, and I've been writing about this issue. And me personally, I would call it a genocide. And I know that it was initiated by several problems, nationalism among different groups, which of course was difficult to handle. So I'm not saying that I'm not saying anything that Sweden should.
I wanted to keep it short. I'll just give you an insight.
I have
my personal view, what we have lived suffered at this time.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I respect your view. You can. I'm not saying that you cannot say
No.
genocide, of course, but there are several aspects of this. What happened in 1950? So
I know.
you know that we are following. I'm following your articles in your newspaper, but we are a couple of times we sent letters to explain you. You know, maybe you could have published these letters to your audience as well. You didn't choose to do that. It's up to you, of course. But I think the Swedish people should know what happened at this time, not from one-sided view, but also from Turkish population view. By the way, I am Kurdish origin. You said that shortly. You said maybe in Kurdish what happened in Turkey. They can say I'm Kurd freely. I'm saying I answered to the Ministry to Public Service. They knew that I was my Kurdish origin. So
It's probably getting better, but it's been worse, I would say.
We have only a few minutes before we should close. Actually, we're out of time, but please go ahead.
Okay. Now the bigger issue here is of how do you handle history, a dark history, the kind of Turkish dark history. By the way, when I write like this from Atatürk to Erdogan and point out the continuities, my leftist friends in Turkey, they are furious. After my recent article, I got a little anger mails from my close friends. Were infuriated by. So there's and also, so I really understand what you say about using Atatürk and Öcalan in the same sentence. You may use it here like that, but talking like that in Turkey would actually harm the cause that I'm trying to promote. It would be politically very silly to talk like that in Turkey in a Turkish context. Absolutely. And now the larger question that your remarks raise is about how do we handle history. Shall we try to try to excavate it, try to face it, or shall we try to forget it, get over it, continue, carry on? And at some point, I think there is a point in forgetting, actually, and because it may do more harm than good. They're trying to dig into old wounds, like 1915, for instance. So I'm not sure where I stand in that question. Actually, I think these questions have to be addressed, but it can also be better to let it go at some point. Now, what you pointed out about the 1970s is important. You said that there were fighting between both sides. Now, true. There were extreme leftist groups who also engaged in acts of who committed acts of violence, but that actually represented a very small part of the killings, and it came as a reaction. What started in 1975 was a very planned killing of leftist students, labor activists, politicians. Okay, it was a concerted, a very organized killing campaign, which eventually, toward the end of the 1970s, did trigger a few acts of violence from extreme leftist groups and so. And a second, what you said about the left after 1980. Yes, they committed a lot of mistakes there. They split into different parties, which of course it prevented them from winning against the right. But something very important was lost 1980, because there was a momentum that was lost. The whole organizational structure of the left and the labor movement was obliterated by the coup. And remember, you cannot have a successful social democratic movement without an accompanying labor organization, labor movement. That is the second feat. You cannot think about Swedish social democracy without the trade unions. So when the political and economic regime that was instituted after 1980 prevented the labor movement from constituting a political force, which actually kind of pulled the rug under the feet of the left. So therefore, even though their personal rivalries did matter, did make life more difficult for the left, it was this institutional arrangement that was put in place by the 1980 regime junta that is the reason why Turkey has not seen a revival of the democratic left. And also, again, as I pointed out, the left also carries a heavy luggage of problems in itself, with its relation to religion, its relation to nationalism, and none of these. And of course, one thing that did change after 1980 was the Kurdish issue. When the uprising in the southeast started in 1984, that kind of changed the dynamics of Turkish politics. That was at least a new dynamic that was brought into it, and which also, I think, made it much more difficult for the Social Democrats to keep their unity.
Thank you. I think we're out of time, so I think we'll stop here. Thank you for all our three speakers for being here, coming here, and for Halil for the book presentation. We hope this is not the last. This is the 7th, you said? 7th, yeah. So we will keep going for some time still, until the next book. We don't have any Turkey events planned. I think the latest one before this was when the Turkish ambassador spoke at the Institute. But I'm sure by come fall, after summer, we will probably come together to speak about Turkey again. Thank you very much. Have a good day.